Record. All right. Let's see if this works. So welcome everybody. It is August. I am back and we are still the online virtual Denver Erlang Elixir meetup. As you heard, we're recording it. I'm trying to post these on YouTube. So we have a handful of those already up there, and that's where this one's going to end up. Quick agenda of how things work around here. So we start with some announcements. We have potentially a couple talks we can share, and then we have a little time for socialization at the end. And I'll go into each of these in a little more detail. So first off, who are we? Hi, we're the organizers. I'm Brett. I'm one of the organizers. We have Jeff and Jeffrey currently. I don't know if we have Alexandra and Dylan on the line, but they are busy with family things these days. So we are the folks that make this thing happen every month, or try to make it happen. How do you get a hold of us? Well, we announce our meetups at meetup.com. We have a presence in the Denver channel on Elixirlang Slack, but we also have our own Slack channel, Denver Beam, free to join. That is definitely the best place to reach us because those messages stick around longer. It's a smaller community. You can DM us. It's the best forum for local discussions. All right, so each month we ask a series of networking questions in our meetup. And the first one being, is there anyone hiring for an Elixir Erlang Beam related job? No, all righty. The flip side of that, is there anybody looking for a job that someone might know of someone else who has a job? All right, this is a very employed group. Glad to see that. Moving swiftly on, call for speakers. So we're a group of volunteers and we need content. So we would love for you to share any ideas, thoughts, projects, questions, investigations that are somewhat related to the Beam. Our bar is pretty low. If you want to test out, say, a conference talk, if you actually just wanted to say, hey, I've never done, say, a live view, and I experimented with that and put together some slides, or these are the things that I learned, good, bad, or otherwise. We traditionally have 2 tracks, one a little more in-depth, one a little more intro. So if you just want to do some really basic things, say you're even new to the language and you're like, hey, what is some of the basic things? We would love to have a shorter talk about some basic things. So if you would like to speak, or also if there's like a topic you'd like to hear about, please reach out to the aforementioned organizers on the Slack channel, and we'll see what we can do. And we'll work with you to shape up your presentation if you would like as well. Are there any general announcements? No. All right, this is a super quiet presentation. All right, so I've been in frickin' lockdown for a long time. We've been doing this online for over a year. So I'd like to propose an experiment. There's been interest in people getting together in real life. We also have a lot of people who are now joining us from faraway remote places. Initially, I would like to try a hybrid approach. What I would like to try to do is have basically an online meetup and afterwards have an in-person meetup. So have people bring your laptop to someplace downtown. We can do it on Zoom so everybody can do the whole thing. And then afterwards socialize. If you want to grab beer, dinner, whatever, we get together. And I'm thinking getting outside just to kind of, keep everybody comfortable. But I need to do some research there, find good internet, find a place that we could meet. So it's an idea, thinking of doing it for September. If you have ideas and suggestions, I'm definitely open to that, but I'm going to try to keep everybody happy. We'll see how it goes.
You cannot win with that.
I will not win. It is true. And eventually I would like to do regular in-person meetups, but I still want to have a remote component too. So watch this space.
Hi guys.
Okay, I'm like, that was not me. If you could please mute if you're not contributing, that would be awesome. All right. This feels like it's a little out of order, but anyway, after we have our presentations, like I'm missing a slide here. I feel as what this feels
We
like.
can skip the talks. It's cool.
Yeah. So we have a talk. After the talk, we have show and tell. So there's an opportunity to share some code. If you got a question, got a problem, discovered something cool, you can share it with the group. It's an opportunity. We open the doors, see what's going on. And then after that, we do Zoom breakout. So if you have a newish client, you should be able to select the room to which you're going to. I guess if you have an older client, let me know and I can move you to a room, but I'll open a handful of rooms and you can pick where you want to hang out and who you want to chat with. So not quite like being in person, but you know, we've had reasonable success with it. So it's not a bad way to chat with people all over the world. So without further ado, our illustrious speaker today is our very own Jeffrey, who's going to be talking about writing maintainable factories. And I suspect it has to do with testing, but that's just me. So with that,
Yay.
I will, oops, did I stop recording?
No,
Stop sharing. I stopped sharing.
you just
Okay.
stopped sharing, which is the thing you
Good.
should have done because I need to share. So
Yeah,
it
you
all
need to
works
share.
out.
The problem is Keynote takes over my whole screen and it's just a
Yeah.
pain. All right. So, my friend, you have the floor.
Hey, folks. How's it going tonight? All right. I got some waves, some thumbs up. More response than you usually get. I appreciate it.
Yay.
So, hey, I want to give you all a heads up before I kick off. That my last hour right before this has been a little bit difficult. I have a son who's having a rough day, and so I'm in a bit of a funky place. That is on top of the fact that this is not the most polished or finished presentation, which is awesome because I said the exact same things when I did the presentation almost 7 days ago, and I have done no work improving it. So this is stuff that I've been playing around with. I'm not necessarily trying to make this a polished conference talk or anything. It's just something that I want information to get out to folks. So, and the last thing I want to say is that I'm about to kick off the the presentation. Please don't hesitate to ask questions during it. In fact, I think that will help it help us figure out how to make the content appropriate for the group. And so by all means, please feel free to ask questions, understanding that I may actually at some point call it and ask us to follow up later in the conversation if I feel like it's straying too far. But that said, this is fairly conversational stuff. So, all right, I am going to. All right, you all should be able to see a big black slide that says writing maintainable factories. Thank you, Brett. All right, so hey folks, my name is Jeffrey Matthias. I am Idle Hands on Twitter. My DMs are open, so if you ever have testing questions, you're more than welcome to hit me up. I also happen to be one of the co-authors of the book Testing Elixir, which comes out technically tomorrow. I don't know. I think they're starting to ship the pre-orders tomorrow. I'm not really sure. I do actually have a copy in my hand though, so I can really show people that I wrote a book. That's very exciting. I wrote it with Andrea Leopardi, who is the core team member on the Elixir core team member that goes by What You Hide on GitHub and Twitter. And we wrote a book. It was very exciting. I got my start in programming. It was with about a month into my first job. I was working Ruby, and I got informed that I was because I was so gung-ho about test-driven development when I came into my interviews, that I was now the official expert on TDD, and my team was going to learn it and I was going to teach everybody. And that was one of those things where it's trial by fire, right? Like, fortunately I rose to the occasion, but learning that stuff kind of set my career path and helped me it put me in a position where testing ended up being really important to how I navigated through the career of being a software engineer. So today, and then when I got to Elixir, I discovered that, you know, like there was not really good consistent resources. So that's part of how I talked Andrea into writing that book. So now that it's out there, hopefully people will love it or hate it, but at least they'll be talking and discussing and coming to some sort of consensus about testing. So for today, we're gonna first talk about what a factory actually is, what some of the options are besides using factories for creating test data, and then things that I'm quite sure of related to factories. And then I'll actually show you all some stuff too, where I'm kind of playing around and may or may not be building out patterns that I like. So as I said, this is a bit of an informal talk. First thing though is, what is a factory? So factory is kind of a overused term. I believe that it first came from a Java pattern where the idea was just you've got code that generates preloaded existing instances like with certain characteristics. But it has been kind of grabbed, and through through several different through the years has also come to mean data or something that just generates data specifically for testing, as opposed to just generating data in a consistent pattern. Period. It's focused towards testing. When we talk about factories in Elixir or the Ruby world where I came from 6 years ago, we are often referring to the code that we call from our test to generate, to do our setup, right? And so there's 4 stages to any good test. I should say up to 4 stages to any good test. Some of them don't need them all, but one of them, if there's any sort of state, especially, you've got the setup step, you've got an exercise step where you're actually, or a kickoff where you're running the code that's under test, you've got assertions, and then you've got a cleanup, right? And so factories are something that we use heavily in that first stage, that setup. And I mentioned something about state. Not all tests. In fact, if you're doing things that are purely functional, there is no state. At that point, instead, the data that you're putting in is actually, oh bother, that was not supposed to happen. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. That'll teach me to bump my keyboard. And literally cannot figure out how to get out of this. Hang on just a second. Sorry, friends. This is actually just how I buy time. Somebody told me I had to do this for a certain amount of. And this is recorded, right? This is all being recorded. Is that what you're asking? I have to drop. Sorry, yeah, guys. It is recorded, Mark. Sorry. Sorry, we're gonna miss out on you. All right. I'll have this back up in 2 seconds. All right. I assume I'm back.
Yes, yes, you are.
Cool. Thanks. All right. So one of the things that's worth noting is that my approach to factories, I mentioned the stuff about state, and often a lot of things, especially if we're working like in a Phoenix project or anything using Ecto, factory can mean that we're going to add things into the database relevant to what we're doing. But as far as I'm concerned, I leverage my factories to generate just about all the data that I use in my testing. And I'm going to circle back in that in a little bit, touch on that. So these days, especially, in Elixir, if you say factory, I'm working with a factory, typically people assume that means you're using a library, most often Ex Machina from Thoughtbot. It doesn't have to. All a factory is literally just a module or a repository, a centralized place for generating data. So while I do often use Ex Machina for stuff, I'm not. There's some things about the API I'm not a huge fan of, and I actually try to only use a limited set of its functionality. So I've also spent some time writing my own factories. I'll show some stuff where I was playing around with that at some point. But we'll dive into that in a few minutes. Before we do that, though, let's talk about what what your other choices are. So one of them, and this is pretty common, and I cannot emphasize enough that this conversation, this is how I do things, right? I think that the other two things I'm talking about here are perfectly valid, and then sometimes I can even be convinced that they're the right things to do. Although, as a default, I tend to lean towards the factory pattern, and I'll go into that why as I discuss each of these. But so, using your own code, let's say that you have a user that you need in a test. What's better than actually running, getting that user through all the functions that you actually use in your application to create a user? The advantages of that are clear. Your test data is going to be as accurate as possible, right? I find the downsides to that is that it tends to force me into having to start at the beginning of a flow. I work on applications often that have where people either have long histories or like data in the database has a long history where it goes through stuff over time, and I don't want to have to necessarily work my data all the way through that the whole flow just to be able to test a certain piece of functionality. And especially because I tend to write largely just focus on one concept or assertion, not necessarily a single assertion, but like one concept or just trying to validate one thing per test, which means that if I were trying to cover a whole bunch of behaviors, I'd actually have to either prep that data in a setup all so that it's a single one that's usable, or actually, and then you potentially run into state problems, or the other side of it is recreate that user every single time, which is time consuming. So for me, it's one of those things where and then the last thing about it is, while it does work as documentation, test as documentation, reading tests as documentation are one of the biggest uses they have for us, especially coming into things 6 months, a year after we wrote them, or worse yet, or more commonly, I say, coming into somebody else's work, right? So those tests can read as documentation. When you're using your production code for your setup, aside from being limited on how like the actual configurations you can do, one of the other side challenges that is it actually doesn't describe the state of the data to somebody who's reading the test, and so they don't actually have a mental model of what that looks like or what the state of the data is. I prefer to understand what the data looks like, and so again, that puts me back to creating it in the test itself, and then again I'll touch more back on how I emphasize what's useful. The other one is fixtures. Fixtures are basically when you're using a file that then just generates data and shoves it into your database. And that means that it's predefined things. You'd have a perfectly, ready to go user. You try to hit the different use cases. And it is another perfectly reliable thing. And I will use this, but typically I do it for stuff where I'm more focused on the shape of the data than I am the actual values, because I personally dislike the disconnect or the implicit connection that has to happen between the test and the fixture data. It means that the test has to know often what is actually in the fixture itself. And so hey Jeff, it looks like you had a comment. Do you want to? Would you be happy to, or would you be okay
Sure.
to say it out loud?
Sweet. Yeah, I'm happy to say that. I didn't want to interrupt your flow, but
yeah,
I forget that you always read the comments. So as a caution for using your own code or using business logic in your test suite, if you use that business logic for setting up your initial state before running your test, if you make any changes to that business logic later, you are implicitly changing how all of those tests function. So but before I got
I missed one of my major
this
points on that. Thank you. Yeah, like I just walked right past it. Please keep going.
Yeah. So before I've gotten burned enough on this, I would, just reuse code and then have some really tight coupling with exactly how my implementation was. So were I ever to change it, I would have to face breaking hundreds of tests, and then you're incentivized to not change that code.
That's a great point. And the other side of it too is, like, if you accidentally mess up that logic or something. I'd rather just have a test that we're focused on that telling me what the problem is than every test that used it as part of the setup blowing up, because that, every once in a while we get presented, we'll do something where we get presented with a wall of test failures and like trying to figure out or pick apart what we've done. Sometimes it's obvious. You're like, oh, it's the last thing I did. Other times it's not so obvious. And so I really like when the test failures themselves are able to pretty quickly direct you to what's shifted. But thanks, Jeff. Appreciate you sharing your experience, for sure. I don't think I'd actually heard that before. So, I don't know. Oh, there you go. I was supposed to go through the. So, I have some rules that I push pretty hard. I think Jeff is laughing right now because he realizes that I was very lazy in my slides and actually grabbed code straight out of one of our projects at work. But so there's some rules I have. Like, you can get yourself into the exact same rat's nest, or not the exact same, very similar problems if you're not careful with your factories. Every project I've ever worked on eventually ends up at those places, and I have figured out some basic rules that make your test better and will also help you stay out of it. And the biggest thing is inside of your factory functions. And this is an example of a return value from an ex machina function. And you'll notice what it's doing here is it's building a valid filter and it's building a client. Probably then this gets inserted into the database. So those are implicitly then also there. And then eventually at some point, you're going to figure out that the client had a profile image that we needed to have set a specific way in context of this, but somebody who's coming into this doesn't, all they see is something that says like insert SMS campaign, and they have no idea the tree of dependencies that or nested data that is being created in this. And so updating the tests are very difficult. Nobody reading the test knows what's happening in it. So this is the number one rule. If you walk out with nothing else from this conversation, or from this talk, it is do not nest the creation of data inside of the creation of data in your factory. I will show you. I'll find some examples of it in some code of what it looks like to not do that in a little bit.
Why?
Why what?
Why don't nest the creation of the data?
I literally don't know what to say here, Brett. I spent the last like 4 minutes explaining it.
Okay, so
do you want me to try and give you a real quick update?
No. Okay, I'm trying to be devil's advocate here. So what, like, we do that, but it's like standard default things that we don't want to specify. Is that a lazy use case then?
Yeah. So what I would say to that is it just depends on how big your application gets, but it inevitably, I have never seen it not cause pain after a year, after the year and a half mark of somebody, or 2 year mark of somebody, where and part of it is, again, one of the things you're doing is trying to just remind people how things are built, and it's not that hard to just also build or insert a thing and then pass it as an overwrite into your factory, right? So like build a filter, and then it's clear to people that the filter that you've used, because it came from a factory, doesn't have anything special about it. And in fact, and I'll get, let me follow up on my next points, and hopefully that'll actually, it'll tie in with this a little bit, I think. And I'm more than happy to circle back. And that is, randomize all the things. So there are two kinds of data in your test. There is incidental data, and there is, bloody hell, I forgot the word, intentional data. There you go. Intentional data is, it's pretty good when you've made up terms and you can't remember them. Intentional data is data that is relevant to the functionality of the code that you're testing, right? So if the name, or in this particular case, this example of looking at, like, oh, the age of the fan, if I'm testing Well, yeah, in this particular case, it looks, I can read this example and I can tell right now that the age of the fan is important to whatever the logic I'm testing is. I don't even know what's going on here, but I do know that I just created a client with a minimum fan age of 13. And then I can see here that I'm creating a fan that's at least that's 14-ish years old, meaning that whoever wrote this test was making darn sure that this was not a non-issue, right? So there's logic under there. So the problem with relying on so one of the things that I come across a lot is people actually set the factory. Okay, great. The default minimum age for this thing, for this application is 13. So we'll set the factory to have an age of 13 or an age of 14. The problem is people change factory values all the time. There should be nothing sacred in your actual factory. What your factory should be doing is generating randomized good data, and then which we're going to call the incidental data, and then anything that is important to your test should be passed in as an overwrite, even if it's the default on that factory. That means that your test will be resistant, or that call to the factory and that test will be resistant to people tampering with the factories. And it will just keep things cleaner. I cannot promise this enough. But with that, here I can also recognize that, you know, it did not take it took an extra line of code, I'll admit, right? Or two, I guess, since this is split out, to pass in a profile image instead of implicitly building it under the hood. But the catch is now I know, again, like it didn't take long to do it. It's not relevant here. And honestly, even if you wanted to do this, like if this is something you keep finding yourself doing in a single file several times, then you can always do something like creating a local function that kind of handles that or dries it up for you. But the biggest thing is I cannot emphasize, like, to me, what makes me happy is when I can understand everything that's important to a test without having to leave the file that I'm in, right? And so this is one of those steps. We can circle back on it, Brett, too.
Okay.
Yeah. So I see there's a got it. Okay, cool. And so another thing I really like to do, and this ties in with what I was saying before, is even when you're not doing stateful testing, sometimes you still need values to pass in for most, when you're testing most things. And so I really like to generate. I like my factory to be the place where I generate specific kinds of data. And the reason I do that is because it turns out that, and a really good example might even be this, right? Where we're using Faker internet domains. So we're using Faker to actually generate some of our stuff. But at some point we realized, there was a switch in the world where more predominantly, things became HTTP instead of HTTPS, right? And so all I had to do to make my test more realistic is just update one single place in the entire code base, and suddenly the tests were then anywhere where it wasn't being explicitly tested, it being HTTP or HTTPS, the data is more realistic. It's not going to catch anything. Sometimes I don't know, let's say you wanted to switch the algorithm, collectively your company decided to switch the algorithm you're using to generate your UUIDs. Well, then that suddenly is very relevant. We use UUIDs all over the place in the code bases that I work in. And now all we have to do to update the entire test suite is to update that one place, right? And so I highly recommend letting your factories be the source of that information. And yeah, that means that, and then on top of that, once you generate random data, and I didn't really follow up on this very well, once you generate random data, like especially if it's like a pass through on something, you go back and you reference, you bind it to a variable or whatever. And so you have that data to assert that it got passed through your code or whatever it is. So it's not like you're not paying attention to those values, but what you're explicitly stating is, for what I'm testing here, this value is not important. It's important that there is a value and it's the right type, but the actual specifics of the value is not important. What we care about is, whatever the test is describing. I have no idea how many rules I have. So for all I know, okay, cool. So apparently that was the last of the major rules. There you go. So now you know how to write maintainable factories. It's really weird to say like, hey, these 3 rules, the biggest one I can't emphasize enough is don't do that nested stuff that Brett wants to do. Yeah. It can lead to things being easier, like for a while, right? Like they definitely are easier for a while. If you end up with like having to be like, well, to make to insert this, I need to create these other 3 things and put them into that, and then I need to do that, and then I need, and like have to keep building it. Like that alone might be a test smell where your tests themselves are telling you that your code might, and it's a smell, just like a code smell, right? Like, so it's not a guarantee that something is wrong, but if you're actually, to get your test to pass, having to do several levels of nesting, because the code that you're doing, like working on, it's relevant to it, it may be that code is actually caring too much about deeply nested things, right? Like, so you can choose for yourself on that. Like I said, it could be a smell. It's not necessarily a sign that something is truly wrong. But a lot of times too, earlier I showed that thing about the profile picture or profile image. A lot of our stuff, we don't need a profile image. Like the stuff we're doing when we're testing that client that had that profile image, it's not even relevant. So I don't need to even pass in a value for it, right? And so that, again, that kind of helps drive home what is like in your test, what's actually important for the behavior of the for the functioning of the code. So yeah, the next thing is just play around, try things, figure out what figure out things that you like or that are readable. At the end of the day, more than just about anything else, readable tests are important, and readable data setup. And so from that standpoint, I guess it's a good time. I'm gonna go poke around a couple different code bases. And
for your question.
Oh yeah, please, Roland.
What's the difference between a factory and property-based testing?
Oh, that's a great question, especially when I tell people to randomize their data. They think what I'm trying to tell them to do is a poor man's version of property-based testing, which I am not advocating at all. Okay, so property-based testing is where you exhaustively throw different inputs into a function and make sure that inputs that it functions correctly with the right shape and types of inputs. And so it's almost spamming, like you're literally using a generator that has rules to it, and it spits out tons of data based off of that. If the thing fails, then it starts to modify it and tries to actually identify exactly what about that piece of data broke the thing when it was supposed to pass. It is really cool. It is also really slow, and it is really important for the places where it's really important, and everywhere else it is overkill. So when I say randomize your data, it's not because I'm trying to accidentally find values that break your code so that we find bugs or edge cases. It's specifically because that data should not break your code. Therefore, you're actually indicating in your test that it's not important. And then every once in a while, you'll come across something. You'll just have like that random test failure that breaks. You can pass in the seed, figure it out, and it may be that you actually did accidentally stumble on something, but that's not the ultimate. That is bad data or gets you that, but that's not the ultimate goal. That's not what you're aiming for. As opposed to property-based testing, what you're trying to do is figure out if there's data that fits that you think should work that's actually breaking the code. That was a great question, Roland. Thank you. Sweet. All right. Anybody else before I start kind of poking through code? Yay. All right. Why did I open this? Oh, I don't want to look at that right now. Okay. Ooh, that's just the presentation we're looking at. That is something wasn't supposed to be open. I thought I prepped all this. I told you I wasn't in a great place before we started. All right. So one of the things that I like to do. Oh, by the way, we're kind of past the like maintainable factories. Now we're just seeing some of the stuff that I'm playing around with patterns and stuff. And I'll talk about what I've had good success with and what I haven't. One of the things that helps people really decide that I'm one of the most uptight testers they've ever met is that when I test an ecto schema, I actually keep a running list of the fields and the types at the top of my test, right? And then I have tests that go through that schema. They call the underlying thing and double check that this definition at the top of the file is actually accurate. And more recently, I have actually added in a macro that just writes the exact same test, right? So you can hand it a schema and one of those lists of types, and it writes the test for you. And that was just to make it, because I'm lazy, and lazy is important in what we do, right? But so one of the reasons this is fun is that it gives us a lot of flexibility in the way that we generate some of our data. So this, and what I'm showing you now is probably most specifically useful for like schema testing. But one of the biggest things that our schemas have, like here's a unique constraint. I'd rather find something else. Let's see. I'm not gonna look at that. All right, we'll go back to that then. There you go. This is what I was looking for. Returns a valid change set when given valid params, right? Well, all valid params have to be then is something that matches that data type. And so because we have this right here, this function, or this list, we can actually give ourselves a way to dynamically generate that kind of stuff. And so we can go through here and just build out little tiny generator functions for each of the data types that we potentially have. And you can see here we have some enums, some custom data types, right? And so I've gone and done stuff from that as well. And it randomizes that information, right? And why do I care about that? Because now all of a sudden, if I add a new field to my schema, it's going to fail that part above, right? Where it was like making sure that the test had the same definition. So then I'm going to go add that to the test, to that list at the top of the test. And now what's happened is anything that's built off of this, that test is actually updated, right? As soon as I added a new schema and field up to the top of here, it now is something that I can produce valid data for, and therefore make sure that it works well for a change set, right? And inversely, you can also see when the params can't be cast. And so we also have another function called invalid params, right? And it's the same basic concept, except for whatever the generator function generates, it is something that it's a result that absolutely cannot be cast by ecto back over into the correct type. And so that sets us up to be able to then, just without thinking, we've got a self-updating test. And when we do this, then that would show, again, if you added a new field, it will break because your definition at the top isn't accurate. As soon as the definition at the top is accurate, though, then you can use that definition as a resource throughout your testing. And I'm sure there are more ways to get playful with that. If you've got any ideas, I'm super interested because I think this stuff is fun. And I really, really like writing tests that I don't have to maintain. But one of my biggest pet peeves is when I go into a test and I see that somebody was very extensive about testing like all the fields being correct. And then at some point you can tell like more and more fields got added to the original thing, and the tests don't reflect that. They were never updated to, right? And it's because it's hard, right? Test maintenance is a pain. And like every time I do something, I don't then immediately want to go hunt down every place it possibly could have been asserted that it had the correct values. I would much rather instead figure out how to dynamically do it. The catch is, though, is that your tests cannot use the code as a reference, because if you change your code, then then your tests will dynamically update themselves incorrectly, right? And so you'll notice that I'm using a local copy or a hard-coded copy of the types and schemas and checking it against the schema, as opposed to using the information from the schema, because if I deleted a field, then the test would instead stop checking it or making those assertions, right? So that was one fun thing. And then another thing I've been playing around with is I really want to do a show of hands, but there's very few people with video on. I was just kind of curious who here is using multiple contexts in their application code. But unless like the 3 people or 5 people with their want to raise their hand. All right, so context, something that Phoenix has introduced. It's basically it's based off of some concepts from domain driven architecture, or domain driven design. But the idea being is that your application is actually split into different sections, right? And those different sections are based around a specific use case or who is using it, what they're doing with it. So that, for example, a user and an admin should be operating with and working against different sections of your application, perhaps, right? Or I liked an example earlier in a conversation I saw where somebody said, well, think about a sales application where like the person who's making the sale cares about one thing, but the automated code that's generating invoices doesn't care about the age of that person, right? They have different needs for the data. They're different uses. And so with that, I would encourage people first off, I encourage people to start thinking about context when they break up their applications or design their applications. The second thing I would encourage is people to be thinking about, when you do that, it is okay to have more than one schema file defined for a single database table, right? It's based off of what that individual context needs. So in the case of that sales app I was talking about a second ago, when I'm testing the code about generating invoices, or when I'm writing the code about generating invoices, my schema doesn't need to have anything about age. My schema doesn't need to have probably a lot of the fields that somebody who's actually doing a sales call would need for their information, right? And so by doing that, what you can do is pair your application. When you're working in that code, you're paring it down to only the stuff that you care about. There's a lot less. I don't think, I don't know about everybody else, but I spend a lot of time when I'm working in a lot of applications trying to like keep track of the stuff that I don't need or is not relevant to what I'm doing right now, right? Like, oh, these 4 functions don't have anything to do with what I'm doing. That's a totally different use case, but somehow they're threaded in with the other stuff I'm working in, right? And so context leave you with simplified things. But the one thing that I've been playing with it that I feel pretty good about, not necessarily the way that I achieved it, but the idea of having different factories, a factory for your contexts, right? And so in this particular case, we have a client here that actually has more fields than the client that we need in other situations. The only thing we need in other situations is a minimum fan age and I think an ID or something like that, right? And so there's no reason when I'm working in that section that I would need to care about all those things. But so the catch is, of course, is that your factory should be returning data specific to what you're working on. And so what I've done here, and again, I take this with a grain of salt, or take it what you will. So far, I'm actually happy with it, but I don't want you to walk out of here in a year like assault me at a conference or something like you told me. But what I did is I created a factory template, and so with a using, right, which is what you're going to see right here, with a using, I am now getting all of the stuff that is common. Remember I said I wanted a common idea of what I don't know what I picked, or the examples I gave you before, but like state code or a state code or a device type. At some point we may actually have a way better concept of what should be in the device type fields, and then it might become more relevant or just provide be better data, so we can update this. So I still wanted to maintain that single place where I was defining the main generation functions, but what you're going to see is that that's actually all that is in this particular file. And then the other thing it's doing is it's doing what I needed for the Ex Machina, because that is what we're using here, right? And so by doing that, this thing is now set up to work just like any other Ex Machina factory I have. It's got these available to it internally, right? You can see first name here, for example. And these then are also available to whatever tests are using need it. So if you need to generate data in your test, randomized or whatever, then you can still call these things as well. Hey, Rudolph, I see that you have your hand raised.
Oh yeah, it was a little bit off-topic question, but what is the reason in this case to use code injection with macro instead of just importing this bunch of functions? I see just the functions that we want to reuse them in that
that is a great question, and the answer is the very last thing I was talking about, where I actually want them to be available to like externally as well, right? I want to be able to call onboarding like from one of my tests here. Let me just find an example of that, right? Oops. So of course this could be one of those places. There you go. So in this particular place, I wanted to be able to call onboarding factory dot phone number, right? So I needed a publicly exposed
I guess it's some kind of cross-context testing when you are from different place want to test something related to this onboarding factory. Kind of makes sense.
I'm not sure that I understand. Like, I actually highly recommend, if you're in a well, first off, if you are doing cross-context stuff, that's another place where you just have to be careful. It's not that you shouldn't have context interacting. It's just that ideally, if you can get away with it, you don't. But what it comes down to, like what it came down to, is I wanted them to be publicly available, as though I had actually defined them inside of a standard factory, right? In an application where I only have one.
Yeah,
so
it makes sense.
Okay, yeah, and if you've got another way to do it, all for it. This is, remember when I said take this with a grain of salt? That is exactly the part I was talking about, is that I'm using a macro and injection as opposed to anything like as simple as an import. But this is how I figured out how to get it to work. And then I'm going to show you one other thing that really take it with a grain of salt. But what I because yeah, don't do as I say, not as I do. So one of the things that you can see in our, like one of our test cases, is that it actually looks for a keyword called context, and then it goes and looks that up, and depending on whatever context you pass it, it'll actually assign the correct factory to that as factory, right? So inside of your tests, you can just call factory, because I'm lazy and I don't want to write onboarding factory every time. The example I showed you earlier was a place where I actually was dealing with something that actually has to deal with both contexts, and that's why I was calling onboarding factory explicitly. But let's see. So context. I gotta move the Zoom stuff. So here you can see that we've got a fans data case, clients and admins. And so when this gets passed in, that means that we would have, it's going to have the correct one. Or let me find one that I'm more familiar with, because I'm just, all right. So we've had base rights, right? So like this happens to track directly to the events-based right factory. But by doing this now, and to be clear, this is a separate factory. This is something that like is based off of other logic we got to do. But here you go. So here we're able to just call factory directly, right? So again, this is me kind of playing around. and trying to figure out, like, it's always a battle between what's the easiest thing to learn and maintain versus what's confusing to new people, right? And so I think this actually sides on the this is confusing to new people side, which may or may not disqualify it from being something that I would continue to do. But let's see. And then actually, you know, while I mention it, I could talk about this real fast too. This is Event Factory. We do a lot of eventing stuff. And so we have all these context, all this information that we work within the context of an application. And then there's actually an interface to the rest of our service. And so what we've done is we've got a module that's the entire job is basically just to convert things over into factories for the sake, or sorry, over into our concept of events for the sake of testing. But I'm trying to think. So it's, you know, and that is something that I didn't want to blend it together because as much as I like to have things together for readability, using separate files also communicates things, right? And so it just fundamentally comes down to, what do I want to communicate to the people who are reading this test? What are they after? That I think got me through the end of my playing around. Oh yeah, I got one last, and I have one last slide, which is kind of ridiculous. There you go. I'm Jeffrey Matthias, Idle Hands on Twitter, and if you want to buy the book, which it will not hurt my feelings if you don't, I promise. I just posted that link into the Who's He What's It into the chat. So with that, are there any other questions or anything anyone wants to talk about, or you're welcome to berate me on how I'm wrong. That's good, because if anybody tried to argue with me, I was just going to do this, right? No.
Will you autograph books, Jeffrey?
Yes, but I gotta tell you, the signature I can get you is not the one that's actually that you care about. So the downside to having a co-author in another country during COVID is that I don't know. It may be quite a while before anybody ever gets a book signed by both authors. We'll see. So
anybody?
Yeah. Sweet. Forrest, what's up?
Hey, sorry guys.
No.
Had some stuff going on in the background, but and joined a little late. How was the process of writing a book? Maybe you already talked about that.
I did not.
Okay.
The idea tonight was mostly, I'm happy to talk about this, but my
Just
goal tonight.
Briefly, I'm curious.
Yeah. I will talk about my specific experience, and then I will actually give you information that might apply to you. I am not. Maybe talk about it not recorded. You know what? That's not a terrible idea, Jeff.
Yeah.
It's unmuting to be like, wait, stop.
Yeah.
With that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, hey, Brett, would you actually be up for ending this portion of it? And then
sure.
I'll be
If
more
nobody
than happy
has
to,
any other on topic
testing related
questions.
Yeah.
Going once, going twice. Thank you, Jeffrey. That was awesome. And with that, we will go off script.